again, and that is that the amendment be disagreed to, and give the call to the member for Dunkley.
Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Member for Lilly, remember this moment. Like everyone who's spoken before me, or at least everyone on my side of the chamber who's spoken before me, I find this piece of legislation both important and disappointing. You know, important because any reform to the childcare subsidy system, which under the Morrison government is flawed and one of the most expensive in the OECD, is welcome. Disappointing because it just doesn't go far enough. And of course it's not as good as the policy that was announced by the Leader of the Opposition. And I join with my colleagues in urging the government to put aside petty partisanship and to look to improve this legislation and the system in the way that federal Labor has proposed. But it's not just that lack in this legislation that is disappointing. It's the lack of any vision for what early childhood education and care really is about. The disappointment is a lack of any vision for how to make the working lives of the frontline workers, who are predominantly women, without whom we could not have got through last year and the lockdowns in Victoria, and without whom we will not be able to get through the current lockdown and any that we may have in the future. So how to make their working lives better. No vision for how to improve their pay. No vision for how to improve their working conditions. No vision for how to say early childhood educators and carers are crucial because they are looking after and they are educating our children and our future. No vision for how to make early childhood education and care an integrated part of the education system so that it can be one of the tools that we have to address disadvantage, socio-economic disadvantage, systemic disadvantage across the country between communities, because that's what education should do, and early education and early childhood education should be a part of that. Now, the disappointment in this legislation is a lack of vision for having a culture in this country where the care of children isn't a women's issue, where the care of children is a human issue, it's a family issue, where we acknowledge that childcare is the responsibility of both men and women. A lack of vision for understanding how early childhood education and care is an economic driver, how workforce participation is an economic driver in this country, both to bring about economic growth, but also, again, to bring about equality in terms of economic opportunity, to have an economy that grows for all, not just for some. We need to be assisting all to participate as much as they want to and to their full capacity. And so this legislation, which does bring about some change, and which it's worth noting comes about despite the fact that the Prime Minister and his ministers and his government derided Labor for saying that the childcare system needed to be fixed. Despite the fact that it makes some changes, it doesn't go far enough. Not every child in our country can access the quality early learning they need, and we can't accept that. That should not be good enough for a prosperous and successful country like ours. You know, systems which are based just on workforce participation of parents, excludes some children from the early learning system, and it often excludes children that need it more than others because they aren't getting the same level of early education and care at home as other children. You know, the cost of accessing early learning for those extra days, the third day, the fourth day, the fifth day, not only is preventing predominantly Australian women from going back to work, it's preventing their children from getting the early education and care that they deserve and that they should be entitled to. The gender pay gap in this country is unacceptably high and stubbornly high, and any reductions that we have seen in the last few years can be attributed predominantly, not entirely, but predominantly to general wage stagnation and issues with men's pay in areas like mining not going up. And it's linked to occupations like early education and care. Occupations that are seen as gendered, are gendered, and are undervalued traditionally because they are seen as women's work and caring. So we have to change the way we view early education and care in this country, to value it for itself, to value it for what it gives to our children, to value it for what it gives to parents who want to work, to value it for what it gives to the economy. We also have to change a view that is embedded in our industrial relations system and how often pay is set, that somehow work that is predominantly done by women is worth less than work that is predominantly done by men. We have to change that. And that is a role for government as much as it is a role for society. And it's a role for government with its industrial relations policies, with things like equal remuneration orders, with getting in there and saying this industry needs to be paid more, the workers in there need to be paid more, because that is in part the way we value the work that they do. Labor's policy is to give this work, early education and care, the value that it deserves. Labor's policy is to take the pressure off almost every working family in this country in terms of affordability of childcare. It's to allow parents to get back to that fourth and that fifth day, and it's to remove structural barriers that prevent it. Now, Labor will scrap the $10,560 childcare subsidy cap, which is that barrier that I just spoke of. A Labor government would lift the maximum childcare subsidy rate to 90%, and a Labor government would increase childcare subsidy rates for every family earning less than $530,000. Now, more than 100,000 families are locked out of childcare because they can't afford it. 100,000 families across this country. And that's not acceptable. Under Labor, the Productivity Commission would be asked to conduct a comprehensive review of childcare with the aim of implementing a universal 90% subsidy for all families. It should be seen as part of our education system. From the start of your life to the end of your life in this country, you should be able to be continuously learning. You should be able to access education and training, no matter where you live, who your parents are, or what your background is. You cannot in this country at the moment. We need a public education system that allows that. And it's something that my community absolutely understand. Just want to finish my contribution, like many others before me, by acknowledging the amazing work of the early childhood educators and carers across my electorate. Now, just recently, since the most recent lockdown that we've had in Victoria, and here's hoping we don't have another one for quite some time. You know, I've had the opportunity to visit Monique at the Early Learning Sanctuary in Frankston, Kylie at Genius Early Learning Centre in Seaford, Ruby at the Veronica Street Children's Centre in Langwarrin, and Jodie at Kidding Around Childcare Centre just across from John Paul College in Frankston. You know, and what these centres have in common is that they're run by people who are absolutely passionately dedicated to the future of the children that they are entrusted to care for 1 to 5 days a week. And I spoke to parents at many of those centres, predominantly women, who understand the value of the people that work at those childcare centres, because they are handing over their most precious loved ones, their children, for hours and days of the week. And they want their carers and early educators to be paid properly. They want them to have wages and conditions that reflect the work that they do. They also want to be able to afford to give their children that opportunity for that early learning as many days as possible without essentially having to work for free 2 days a week to have them go there. So on behalf of the Moniques and Kylies and Rubies and Jodies and all of the childcare workers and centre owners across Dunkley, I want to say that we see you and we hear you and we value you, and we know that we couldn't have got through 2020 and the first half of 2021 without you. And I will continue to dedicate my time in this chamber to making sure that you get paid properly, your wages and conditions are at the standards that you deserve, and that parents across this community can send their kids to early learning and childcare without wondering how they're going to pay for it or having to give up work because they just can't. Thank you, Deputy Speaker.